The word freelance, the word you use to describe your remote job, your side hustle, your independent career, comes directly from this man. A broke, landless medieval knight who sold his sword to whoever would pay for it. He had a title. He had armor. He had a code of honor he'd die before breaking. And most nights, he slept in a ditch. This is the real history behind Ser Duncan the Tall, and it's stranger, darker, and more human than the show lets on. HBO's A Knight of the Seven Kingdoms, which premiered in January 2026, gave millions of viewers their first look at Ser Duncan the Tall, a lowborn orphan who becomes a knight through stubbornness, loyalty, and borrowed armor. No castle, no lord, no family name worth mentioning. Just a sword, a horse, and the open road. George R.R. Martin calls him a hedge knight, and while that specific term is his invention, the reality behind it is not. Because about 900 years ago, in the real, muddy, brutal, sword-swinging world of medieval Europe, there was a man whose life story reads like Dunk's autobiography. His name was William Marshal, and he started with nothing. No land, no inheritance, no prospects, just a talent for violence and a willingness to bleed for it. By the end of his life, he was the most celebrated knight in England, regent of the entire kingdom, and the man who saved the Magna Carta from collapse. But before all of that, he slept under hedges too. William Marshal is our guide today. His story is Dunk's story, and it's entirely real. To understand why men like William Marshal and Dunk existed, you need to understand the one law that created them: primogeniture. In medieval England and France, land passed exclusively to the eldest son, the second son, the third, the fourth. They received training, a title, and essentially a sword and a handshake. Knights were expensive to maintain. Full armor, a warhorse, weapons, a squire. The cost was the equivalent of several years of an ordinary man's income. Lords were supposed to provide this through land grants. But if you weren't the eldest son, there was no land coming. The result was a permanent underclass of trained, armed, titled men with nowhere to go. They were called landless knights, bachelor knights, or knights errant. Men whose errantry wasn't romantic wandering, but simple economic desperation. The term hedge knight is Martin's poetic naming of a very real phenomenon. And here's the thing. Some of them literally slept under hedgerows because they couldn't afford an inn. That's not storytelling. That was the reality of a Tuesday in the 12th century. So, how did a landless knight with a nice title and an empty stomach actually eat? 3 ways, and each one comes with a catch. Option 1, the tournament circuit. This was the most legitimate path. Tournaments were not just entertainment, they were an economy. A skilled knight could win prize money, but more importantly, he could capture an opponent's horse and armor, and hold the knight himself for ransom. This was entirely legal and culturally accepted. It was essentially a contact sport with a financial reward system built in. This is exactly how William Marshal built his career. As a young, landless nobody, he traveled the tournament circuit in France, winning horses, collecting ransoms, building reputation. Chronicles of the time describe him as almost unstoppable. Tournament organizers eventually had to pair multiple knights against him just to make the matches competitive. In one stretch of his career, he reportedly captured over 500 knights for ransom across a single decade. The man was a walking hedge fund. Option 2, household service. Attach yourself to a lord's retinue and receive food, lodging, and basic wages, but no land. The catch: if the lord died, lost power, or simply no longer needed you, you were back on the road immediately. Option 3, and this one is dark: robbery. Bands of landless knights terrorized the countryside of northern France throughout the 12th century. In Germany, they were called Raubritter, robber knights. men who erected illegal toll gates on roads and simply took what they wanted at sword point. The romantic chivalric knight and the literal highway bandit were sometimes the same person, separated only by how desperate the winter had been. The men who sold their military service to the highest bidder, uncommitted to any lord, were called men with a freelance. That phrase traveled 800 years through the English language and landed directly in your job listing. Every freelancer alive today is etymologically descended from a broke medieval knight trying to make rent. Forget the image of a gleaming knight riding heroically between adventures. The daily reality of a landless knight was logistically brutal. A knight needed a minimum of 2 horses, one for travel, one for battle, because war horses were too valuable and temperamental to ride casually for miles every day. Feeding and stabling 2 horses cost more than feeding a family. Add road tolls, the price of bread and ale, and the constant maintenance of rusting, denting armor, and the economics were merciless. Dunk's armor in the show is one of the most historically accurate things about his portrayal. He builds his kit piece by piece. A gorget here, greaves there, because a full suit of plate is simply beyond his means. Real landless knights wore exactly this: mismatched, second-hand, patched-together armor that told everyone around them exactly where they stood in the social order. A great lord's retinue wore matching livery and polished steel. A hedge knight wore whatever hadn't rusted through yet. And when no inn was available, which was often, they slept rough. Under trees in barn corners against the cold side of a stable wall, the hedge was not a metaphor, it was the roof. Lose your horse in battle, you might never financially recover. Some knights sold their armor, their literal identity, just to survive the winter. The line between a hedge knight and a beggar with a sword was thinner than anyone in a castle wanted to admit. Here is where the hedge knight's life becomes genuinely psychologically fascinating. He was, technically, a nobleman. A knight was gentle, noble, in the eyes of medieval law and culture. He stood above every peasant, merchant, craftsman, and farmer in the social order. Theoretically, even minor lords owed him a degree of courtesy under the chivalric code. But among the actual nobility, the barons, the great lords, the landed families, he was invisible. He had no seat at the high table, no family to advocate for him, no land to prove his worth. The economic gap between a great lord and a hedge knight was sometimes as large as the gap between a lord and a serf. This created a trap with no exit. A hedge knight was too noble to work with his hands. That would be seen as beneath his station, an embarrassing collapse of social identity, but too poor to live as the noble he technically was. He existed in a crack in the social fabric that the medieval world didn't quite know how to handle. You see this in every scene where Dunk interacts with great lords. They can't simply dismiss him. The code doesn't allow it, but they can humiliate him, ignore him, and remind him in 100 small ways that his title means nothing without the land to back it up. That tension, honor without power, is the most historically authentic thing in the entire show. William Marshal lived this exact tension for years before a lord finally took notice of him. Even then, he was given a wife and land almost as an afterthought, a reward he had to wait decades for, while lesser men with better surnames moved ahead of him. The romance of knighthood hides a brutal actuarial reality. Early medieval tournaments, the main income source, were not the clean, theatrical jousting of later centuries. The original format was called the mêlée, essentially a controlled battle across open fields where dozens of knights charged each other simultaneously. Death and serious injury were common. There were no blunted weapons, no strict rules, no referee to stop the fight. It was organized chaos with prize money. War, the other major employer, was worse. A landless knight who joined a lord's campaign had no guarantee of pay, no guarantee of survival, and no guarantee of compensation, even if he survived. Lords sometimes simply didn't pay. Disease was a constant, silent killer. Living rough, eating inconsistently, drinking from questionable sources. Fine armor doesn't protect against dysentery. And debt was perhaps the most insidious danger of all. One bad tournament, one dead horse, one winter without a contract, and a knight could slide into financial ruin so severe that there was no realistic path back. Some disappeared from the historical record entirely, presumably swallowed by poverty, crime, or an unmarked battlefield grave. History remembered William Marshal. It did not remember the thousands of men just like him who ran out of luck before a great lord happened to be watching. So, how does Ser Duncan the Tall hold up against the real historical record? Remarkably well, in the broad strokes. His low-born background, latching onto an established knight as a squire and eventually being knighted? Real. That was one of the only legitimate pathways for someone without noble birth to enter the knightly class. His poverty, his piecemeal armor, his reliance on tournaments, all historically authentic. His road-based life with a single companion, in Dunk's case, the boy egg, mirrors the reality of hedge knights who traveled in small groups for safety and company. Where Martin applies a romantic filter is in Dunk's fundamental decency. The real hedge knight world produced men like William Marshal, but it also produced the robbery. It produced mercenary companies that burned villages. It produced men who chose robbery over starvation and convinced themselves the chivalric code still applied somewhere in the transaction. Dunk is the knight-errant of the literary tradition, noble in poverty, tested by hardship, redeemed by character. That's less straight history than it is the medieval romance tradition made flesh. Which, given that Martin built his world on Arthurian myth and Geoffrey of Monmouth, is almost certainly intentional. The show isn't lying to you about hedge knights, it's just showing you the best possible version of one. A few things that tend to genuinely surprise people. William Marshal captured over 500 knights for ransom in tournament competition across his early career. His reputation became so fearsome on the circuit that it functioned as a marketing campaign. Lords competed to hire him. Tournaments were partly invented as social control. By the 12th century, there were so many rootless, trained, armed men wandering Europe that chroniclers wrote of them as a destabilizing threat. Tournaments were organized partly as a controlled release valve. Give them a legal arena to fight in, and they'll be too busy and too broke to burn villages. The Crusades were a literal escape hatch. For younger sons with nothing to lose, the Crusades offered land, glory, a blessed cause, and the genuine possibility of carving out a kingdom in the East. Many of the knights who went east did so, not from religious zeal, but from economic desperation. A Japanese ronin and a European hedge knight are almost structurally identical, masterless, trained for war, caught between dignity and desperation, feared and looked down upon simultaneously. Two cultures, 6,000 miles apart, producing the same tragic figure. Ser Duncan the Tall is a fictional character, but he is built from real bones. The poverty is real. The mismatched armor is real. The tournament circuit is real. The psychological cruelty of being technically noble and practically invisible, real. The dangerous, lonely road stretching between one lord's closed gate and the next, that road existed. Men walked it. Most of them we'll never name. William Marshal got lucky. A lord watched him fight, took a chance on him, and the rest became history. But for every William Marshal, there were 1,000 men just as skilled, just as honorable, just as desperate, whose names dissolved into the mud of an unmarked road, somewhere in France or England in a year nobody thought to write down. That's what Dunk represents, not just a fantasy character. Every forgotten man who had the training, the title, the code, and had to sleep under a hedge anyway. History is full of Dunks. We just never learn their names. Here's the question I want you to think about, and I want a real answer in the comments. Was the chivalric code genuinely believed, or was it a story that rich lords told landless knights to keep them obedient, fighting, and underpaid? Because the evidence points both ways, and I have my own opinion, which I'll share in the next video. Subscribe so you don't miss it. And if this changed how you think about knights, share it with someone who still thinks they were all kings in shining armor.